Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Future Ready Leadership. My guest today is Peter Goodman. He's the global economic correspondent for the New York Times and best-selling author of several books, including his most recent one, which is called How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. Peter, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jake.
So, the topic of a supply chain, I think, is really interesting because most people don't think about supply chains in our day-to-day lives, right? We just go to the store, we buy things, and we think, wow, that's great. Walmart or Target or Whole Foods, they stock that. That's wonderful. So I thought maybe we could take a step back and just look at high level. What exactly is a supply chain? And if you had to explain it to somebody who's just not familiar with, the intricacies, what that actually means, how would you explain it?
I mean, it's basically about how we make stuff and get those finished products to our door with a lot of so-called intermediate products, the things that we move around the globe that get used as parts and components to eventually make finished products. So we got container ships, trucks, trains, wandering around continents, carrying things across oceans, connecting factories to consumers. That writ large is the global supply chain. Your question correctly implies that there are thousands of smaller supply chains that connect the players in individual industries. But yeah, I think to your initial point, it's worth bearing in mind that nobody built the supply chain through some master design. We're invited to not think about supply chains as much as possible. And it's interesting when you actually start contemplating, like, how did my breakfast cereal get here? Who was involved in getting my iPhone to work? You discover that there are just great areas of modern life that are designed to not be thought of, and there are human beings and processes that are behind all of that it turns out when they fail are awfully important.
There was a great video. I don't remember if you've ever seen it. Milton Friedman talking about the number two pencil.
I've heard about Milton Friedman's number two pencil video.
Yeah,
I will confess that I have not watched it.
yeah, I can't remember what year he did the video, but he was doing this really short video where he talked about the number two pencil, and he was basically talking about how so many countries all over the world, whether it's the graphite, whether it's the paint, whether the eraser, the assembly, and he was saying, you might look at this number two pencil and think it's just such a simple thing to create, but it requires so many countries and thousands of peoples and ships and oceans and so much
Right.
of the world to come together to create this little tiny number two pencil that you use to write things down. And I thought it was a great explanation of just how the supply chain works. And so for us, it's really interesting because, like we talked about, we're so used to just getting things, whether
Right.
even with Amazon now, right? It just gets dropped off at my house without really understanding what's required for all these things to kind of come together. And so I'm really curious, when you were writing your book, what surprised you the most when you started digging deep into the supply chain? Obviously, during the pandemic, a lot of things broke. I remember
Right.
at my local store where I was living at the time in the Bay Area, ran out of everything. And it's hard to
Yeah.
imagine how such a big box store like a Ralph's or Target can have empty shelves.
Yeah.
So, what surprised you the most as you were doing the research for this book?
Yeah, what didn't surprise me? It all turned out to be pretty fascinating. You know, just picking up on the point you're making earlier about the graphite pencil, a car today requires 30,000 different parts. Many of them parts attached to other parts to get turned into still other parts, crossing oceans and borders multiple times. So if anything goes wrong, we end up with shortages. One thing that really surprised me, I went to Ford's River Rouge factory. This was the grand factory that Henry
Hmm.
Ford built after the Model T became a huge scale item. It was at Highland Park where he mastered mass assembly, but then he got really obsessed with supply chains, and he wanted to make sure he could never be in a position where he couldn't produce because he was unable to get something. And some of this led him to flights of fancy. You know, he had famously disastrous bender of a rubber plantation that he invested in Brazil. He bought railroads, he bought shipping lines. But so I'm thinking about this as I'm going to visit the River Rouge factory, which still exists, 100 years later. And at this point, you've got a lot of automation, robots, highly trained people running the assembly line, making Ford's F-150. This is the pickup truck that's Ford's best-selling vehicle. And they're able to complete it except for one part, computer chips. This is in early 2022. A lot of the supply chain problems have gotten supposedly back to normal, but Ford is finishing these F-150 pickup trucks and then depositing them in these giant parking lots that are literally next to Ford's corporate headquarters and across the street from Henry Ford Elementary School. And they're just leaving them there because you can't drive them until the computer chips show up. I thought that was not only amazing, but kind of a metaphor for everything that's happened to the supply chain in a century.
Well, it's funny because I think that's, when we look at China and Taiwan, right? I mean, so much of our semiconductor manufacturing it comes from Taiwan, and I think that's one of the big worries, right? That if we ever got into war with China, we would lose access to so much of our semiconductor manufacturing. iPhones, technology, we would be set back, I think some people say 20 to 30 years as a result of our reliance on those things.
Or if China tried to take Taiwan.
Or China tried to take, exactly.
Look, as we speak, we're having a trade war with China, and China has weaponized access to raw materials. We've got huge semiconductor fabs getting built in places where federal subsidies have gone to that purpose. We're talking about Taiwan Semiconductor spending what they tell us is $165 billion to build 3 large fabs outside of Phoenix. Intel's building a smaller complex in Columbus, Ohio.
I think NVIDIA, a lot of companies.
Yeah, but guess what? Like, if we can't get those rare earths, 80% of them are in China. 90% of the capacity for refining them is in China. And if we aren't able to get them, if China says we're not sending them to you, $165 billion worth of semiconductor fabs are basically just empty buildings.
Yeah. I'm curious what you think of this shift that we're starting to see around the Made in America approach. Well, maybe even before we get to that, we can start on why did we start outsourcing and offshoring everything to countries like India, like China, so many different countries around the world? Because originally things did start in America, and then we started pushing everything out. We had the WTO, we invited China in there, they started stealing a lot of IP. We had a lot of challenges with all this. So why did we first start going in that direction where we were relying so much on other countries like China for pharmaceuticals, for machinery, for steel, for so much of what powers our country?
It was cheap. And it was good for the bottom line for publicly traded companies. I mean, it's more complicated than that in some areas, like high tech, for instance. I mean, why does Apple go outside of the United States to make initially desktop computers? Because they just can't find the capacity to make that stuff in the U.S. So they end up with a global supply chain. If you look at industries like furniture, textile, why aren't we making tube socks in North Carolina? Why did we entrust that business first to China, more recently to places like Bangladesh and Pakistan? Because it's cheap. Because you can get your hands on cotton. Because if it's labor intensive, as opposed to capital intensive, wages are just rock bottom. And then we were kind of participants in this fairy tale that the corporate class spun with members of both political parties that, we weren't sending production to China to make money. Yeah, it was good that it was cheap and it was good that we could save some money, but it was really about democratizing China. This was Bill Clinton's story as he pushed to get China into the World Trade Organization in 2001, that money was sort of incidental. It was all about, once we penetrated China with Kentucky Fried Chicken, Chinese consumers would, demand the ballot box. And it was just somehow incidental that Walmart, which was, of course, headquartered in Clinton's home state of Arkansas, was working heavily to open up Chinese factories because some instances, it was a way to undercut union labor at home. It was a way to get out from under having to deal with environmental standards and workplace safety standards. And And it was very good for consumers, and prices got cheaper, and it was very good for publicly traded companies that discovered in China, the solution to all of their cost problems. And it wasn't so good to discrete communities that suffered from the so-called China shock. I mean, we lost something like 1 million direct manufacturing jobs in the decade or so after China enters WTO. But as I argue in the book, I mean, it's not like China did this to us. Like, we did this to us. And it's worth noting that the U.S. is kind of unique in seething with this anti-trade sentiment, largely because we don't have things like national health care. We don't do well by workers who lose their jobs. We're not good at job training. And we've kind of talked ourselves into embracing financial services while abandoning manufacturing as this, dirty, old pursuit that we should just put in the past.
What if I told you the most valuable assets in your organization aren't even being measured, never mind leveraged? We call traits like adaptability and problem solving soft skills, not because they're less important, but because we lack the tools to quantify them. WorkHuman just changed that with the release of Human Intelligence. When I spoke at WorkHuman's event, it was obvious this wasn't just another shiny AI tool. Human Intelligence is the recognition industry's only solution that uses AI trained on real moments of gratitude in your workplace to unhide the skills driving your culture forward. Spot rising stars and hidden leaders, quiet burnout, and more through the collective sentiment of your people, not just the loudest voice. If you care about using AI for the good of humans and organizations, go to workhuman.com and explore Human Intelligence. Again, that is workhuman.com. Yeah, it's an interesting approach because now we're seeing this big push with the current administration to bring manufacturing jobs back to America, both in terms of the tech sector and also just traditional manufacturing, cars, plants. So it'll be really interesting to see what'll happen over the coming years. But it sounds like this all started simply because of the idea we want to get things cheaper so that we can provide better shareholder value, increase our stock price. And so I suppose in a way we shot ourselves in the foot. And it's a good example of why simply pursuing, it's kind of like Enron, well, sort of like Enron, but on a global scale, where we became so obsessed with the end result, with the financials. Not to say that we committed fraud, but we just tried to make things as cheap as possible that we kind of shot ourselves in the foot a little bit.
I mean, we got to take care. Like, who's the we? In this prescription. I mean, in the book, I spent a lot of time looking at the consulting class. I mean, I spent a lot of time on McKinsey. And it's not McKinsey's fault either. It's shareholder maximization's fault.
Yeah.
But I think there is fraud. I mean, I'll give you an example. This
I'm
comes
sure there
directly
is.
out of the book. So rail. Take precision scheduled railroading, which is just in time on the rails. And we should back up and just in time, as a lot of your listeners and viewers probably know, is the outgrowth of the Toyota production system mastered by Toyota at the end of the Second World War, way to limit the costs and complexity of managing lots of inventory. Let's have suppliers just bring stuff that you need to the assembly line as you need it in real time instead of having to put all this stuff in warehouses. Great idea, worked great for Toyota, turned Toyota into, by many measures, the world's most successful car company. Well, along comes this whole concept, this very uniquely American concept of shareholder maximization. And the consulting class says, hey, just in time, this can be applied to everything. This can be applied to how you manage your workforce and when they have to show up for shifts. But basically, don't waste all this money putting stuff in warehouses as a hedge against the problems that inevitably arise, because that's life, right? Like, we don't know what the next crisis is going to be, but there will be one. Just go lean, save the cost of stocking up on inventory, and give the extra money to yourself, corporate executive, as a reward for being smart enough to hire McKinsey. Give it to your shareholder as a dividend. Your share price will go up. Everybody will be real happy. Well, so rail does this. They limit rail service. They slash the workforce. And then the pandemic hits. And suddenly they just can't move stuff from point A to point B. They don't have enough capacity. They don't have enough people. So here's my favorite example of what you're talking about, and what I would say is a kind of fraud. I talked to a guy who's an engineer at Union Pacific, the large rail line that dominates out west, and he's horrified to discover that he's routinely pulling freight to the wrong destination. Now, why is he doing this? Because people are idiots? No, because they're following the incentives. Precision scheduled railroading, the rail companies have told Wall Street, hey, we get it. We're going to prove that we're more efficient than ever. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to limit dwell time. Dwell time is the metric that makes share prices go up. If you hit it right, it's how much time does cargo sit in any particular place. Well, so there's some guy running the Union Pacific Railroad in Nebraska who absorbs this corporate mantra and says, I don't care where stuff's going. The next train out of here, I'm attaching as much cargo to it as possible. So this engineer discovers he's pulling, barrels of chemicals that are needed, some paint manufacturer in Southern California. They're going north to Oregon. It's going to take an extra week to reroute them through Idaho, back down south. He's pulling auto parts that are supposed to go to Northern California, and they're on the way to Oregon. Now, that's not efficient. It's efficient if all you're looking at is a spreadsheet showing how much dwell time has transpired. So that's an example, and there are countless, and I've got lots of them in my book, of how, as the quote that always comes to mind is this one London business school professor put it to me. He said, look, if you can't make a ventilator in the middle of a pandemic because you've gone too far with stripping inventory and you don't have the capacity, you don't get to say, well, at least our share price is high.
Yeah. Well, speaking of rail, I live in California. We've been having our own high-speed rail struggles with our 2008. We passed that ballot measure, and it was supposed to be completed by 2020. What was it? With like $33 billion, and it's 2025 now. It's supposed to be like $120 billion, less than half of it built. So, we have our own rail challenges here in our wonderful, wonderful state of California.
Sure.
So it's interesting how, and I guess when you say we, I guess it would be a combination of business leaders, politicians, just everybody who's been pursuing this idea of shareholder maximizing shareholder value to make things as cheap as possible. But sometimes
Wait, can I push back on that for a second?
Yeah.
I think there's an important distinction to be made between private companies and publicly traded companies. And I'm being somewhat unfair to the forward-looking publicly traded companies that have management strong enough to say to shareholders, hey, if you want to obsess over quarter-to-quarter changes, go buy somebody else's stock. And
Mark Benioff did that.
Well, Benioff has his own problems. He doesn't like to pay taxes.
He does, but I remember many years ago, I forgot what year this was. I don't know, 5-6 years ago. I think he was doing some interview in the process of growing and scaling Salesforce, and somebody was asking about quarterly numbers and it's going down. And during the interview, he said, well, you know what, if you want to buy our stock because of quarterly numbers, you should probably go buy stock somewhere else because that's not what we're focused on.
Yeah. Well, this is a separate conversation, but I'm not sure I buy that Benioff. Well, I mean, my last book starts with, which is Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devour the World, starts with Benioff saying that CEOs deserve all of the credit for the toughest decisions during the pandemic. This he says at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, where he's committed to improving the state of the world. Never mind that he represents the status quo that is benefiting from the world, as it very much is. But that's a separate conversation. And I do have a problem with Mark Benioff not paying taxes while he's and awarding himself enormous stock option payments while he's giving crumbs to try to address homelessness in the Bay Area when those outsized pay packages are a leading cause of the homelessness. But we could spend a separate hour on that. Now I can't even remember what we were talking about. Quarter to quarter. Yeah, so publicly traded companies. Maybe Benioff's one of the good guys in the publicly traded world. But I do think most people running private companies where they are not forced to disclose their quarter by quarter numbers and cater to, some chorus of stock analysts on Wall Street, they don't generally fall prey to these sorts of problems because they can afford to be commonsensical. I'll give you another example from just in time. I remember talking to a guy in Minnesota whose story I tell in the book, who was working at a company that makes giant industrial generators, and they thought that they were managing their inventory in lean and responsible fashion. Along comes a bunch of guys from McKinsey, a bunch of fresh Ivy League graduates in suits from the Chicago office and one older guy. And they immediately say, you don't have any idea what you're doing. Why do you have all this inventory? And they get obsessed over these $5 sheet metal brackets. And the Minnesota guy says, well, look, these are industrial generators. Talk about just in time. We need cranes to install them. If we're late by a day, that's a real problem. We got to get these things installed as they need to be installed. And the McKinsey guys say, no, you got to get rid of your warehouse. So they eliminate things like $5 sheet metal brackets, and then they end up paying, tens of thousands of dollars in special handling charges to make up for the delivery delays. And they kept turning down inventory that they needed. They'd keep it out in the parking lot waiting till the next quarter would pass so that they could jack up their return on assets by limiting their assets by not accepting inventory.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet you probably came across a lot of fascinating and interesting stories just like that. It's hard to talk about supply chain without bringing up some of the current events. As we're doing this recording, we have this potential war that we're seeing with Iran. We see that they have, are hopefully, well, not hopefully, but are approving the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which is, one of the largest areas where we get oil. So I thought we could talk a little bit about the potential implications on supply chain with the Middle East conflict. I don't know if you've been looking at that and following it and doing any kind of analysis on that, but what is your take as far as the Middle East conflict and how that could impact supply chains?
Oh, I think it's just a fact. I mean, if the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted for any length of time, you're going to see a spike in oil prices for sure. And when energy prices go up, that tends to slow economic growth. I mean, it's a tax on everyone, everywhere, unless you're fortunate enough to be self-sufficient in oil. I mean, it actually could be of benefit to the U.S. because the U.S. is now essentially self-sufficient in terms of energy because of the great boom in our own domestic capacity. But it would be recessionary for the global economy if that conflict lasted long enough to seriously disrupt freight. One winner in this, weirdly enough, would be ocean carriers, which may seem to be counterintuitive. But every time there's a disruption to freight, we get reminded of the fact that there isn't really competition on these routes. I mean, there's like 13 or 15, depending on how you count them, large ocean carriers that are present around the world, but they're organized in 3 alliances, similar to airline alliance. Think like your Star Alliance, One World Alliance, and so on. If you're actually trying to move something from Asia to Europe, or Europe to the East Coast of the U.S., or across the Pacific, I mean, this is the most important one, from East Asia to the West Coast of the U.S., there's like 3 alliances that control 95% of the traffic. So every time there's a disruption, shipping prices go up dramatically, and we get a lot of headlines about how the shipping industry is really facing a tough spot. The Red Sea has been closed to container traffic in large part because the Houthis in Yemen have opened fire on vessels headed toward the Red Sea in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. And that has forced ocean carriers connecting ports in Asia to Europe to go the long way around Africa.
Much longer routes,
It's a much longer route, but I've had analysts tell me, okay, maybe that increases the cost by like 40%. There's more diesel, there's longer hours for crew. The shipping rates at different times have been up like 400%. So here's one bet I would make. I mean, if there's serious disruption in and around the Persian Gulf, ocean carriers will log record profits.
Yeah, and for people not familiar, I was doing research on this. So 20% of global oil is basically transported through the Strait of Hormuz, and then around 10% of the oil that we use in the United States comes from that area as well. But to your point, I was even looking at today. Oddly enough, the markets have been up. I think oil prices have been down slightly. So it doesn't seem as if a lot of people are thinking that that's going to be a kind of a long-term conflict as of now. But it sounds like if it was a long-term conflict, you would expect kind of recessionary impact on the global economy as a result of the oil disruption.
I mean, it's a downward force. It's a
Yeah.
significant downward force. I mean, if you jack up people's cost of energy in places where they are very dependent upon imports, Japan, South
Yeah, the
Korea,
Asian markets would get hit very hard.
Europe.
Yeah.
I
I
mean,
think China's
that's a
the
real
one of
force.
the number one um they get most of their oil from that area. So they would
Well, they
be
get it directly from Iran.
yeah,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah, that's right.
they would get hit very, very hard.
I mean, they could buy it somewhere else on the open market, but the market would go up, and it would be like a tax for
Yeah.
sure.
What do you think would have happened if you could go back in time and let's say we never went through this process of outsourcing so much to places like China? What do you think would have happened to American manufacturing, American jobs, American products and services? I mean, would we be spending today, for example, $2,500, $3,000 on an iPhone if we kept all of this manufacturing that we've been doing in the States?
It's an unanswerable question. I mean, who
Yeah.
knows if there'd even be an iPhone, right? I mean, with manufacturing comes innovation. It's very hard to innovate if you don't know how stuff's made, and if you don't have the supply chains around you, you don't have the people around you to talk to bounce ideas off of one another. Certainly, if we didn't have a global supply chain, the iPhone would cost a whole lot more than it does now. I mean, I guess my question, I mean, coming back to this point I was trying to make earlier, I think we want to be careful that we not demonize trade. I mean, no country, not even our own country, has everything that we need. And trade is why we have blueberries on grocery store shelves in New York in the middle of winter. Trade is why we have as many different options as we've got when we go to the store. Trade is why companies that export make more money and pay people higher wages. I think the question we ought to be asking is, what are the rules of trade, and what happens to the people who get lost along the way, and who gets the benefits? And if we did a better job with those questions, instead of having these conversations where it's, Beijing is the great demon. Look, why did we abandon Michigan and Pennsylvania factory workers to joblessness, depression, suicide, alcoholism, the opioid? How did that happen? That wasn't done in Beijing. That was done in Seattle, in New York, in Washington. We decided that we would organize our trading system around returning as much wealth as possible to Jeff Bezos. China took the same bounty of global trade, and they invested in infrastructure and schools and housing. And I mean, China's got all sorts of problems. I mean, they have a real estate bubble. I'm not saying
Yeah, the real estate in China is
yeah, I mean, it's a bubble, and I value my American civil liberties, and I feel fortunate that I was born here and not in mainland China. But let's get real. I mean, their system has taken the bounty of trade and has invested it toward the benefit of more people than we have, and as a result, we got a lot of people here who are really angry about that. I think we can have trade and manufacturing and innovation and still have global supply chains, provided we've got programs that make it a little easier for people who need to be trained for a new career, need a little extra help with healthcare, housing when they lose a job. That's home cooking.
yeah. During the pandemic, were there some companies that you saw that were able to adapt well when compared to others when thinking about the supply chain? Because I would assume, of course, in the coming years, there's going to be other challenges, other changes that are going to impact supply chains. Who knows whether it's going to be a war, a pandemic, or,
Right.
whatever it might be. And so a lot of organizations, I would hope, are constantly thinking about, well, what should we do if anything like that happens with our supply chain? So kind of two-part question. Did some organizations do things better than others? And do you think post-pandemic that these companies learned a lesson? Have they made any changes to their supply chain, or did they just kind of say, woo, glad that's over, back to business as usual?
Oh no, there've been changes. I mean, companies that did better were companies that thought more sensibly about the risks of
Okay.
having supply chains across oceans. And saying that there are risks in having supply chains across oceans is not the same thing as saying we shouldn't have supply chains stretching across oceans. It's saying we should think about resiliency. So you want to rely on China for a lot of your factory production? Okay, that's fine. But if something goes wrong, what are you going to do then? You want to have a backup plan instead of betting everything right there. So Toyota, for instance, adhered to their own principles. I mean, if you go back to just in time in the Toyota production system, central to that was Toyota insisted that their suppliers be clustered close to their original factory in Nagoya. And that principle is held out. I mean, they suffered some shortages like other companies, but less so than companies like Ford, for example, that just entrusted their fate to the global supply chain, quite excessively. In terms of change, and sorry, the biggest companies were, in the position where they could adjust most quickly. So Target, Walmart, Amazon, when shipping prices go up tenfold, and that's real. When the price of moving a container full of goods from Shanghai to LA Long Beach, just to pick two places at random, that goes from $2,500 or so before the pandemic to $25,000 and even more in the worst of the pandemic. Well, if you're Target, Walmart, Amazon, you just charter your own ship. You pay whatever it costs. In fact, they looked at it internally as a chance to pick up market share. Oh, okay, so I'm spending 10 times as much, or in their case, less, because they're buying at such enormous volume that their contracts tend to be honored, and they have long-term contracts that lock them into container rates normally over the course of a year. But even if they're paying the spot rates and they're paying these crazy rates, they can say, well, we're Amazon. We will ride this out. Our competitor will not be able to get inventory at all. They'll go out of business and we'll end up with greater market share. So they were in a greater position as well. Smaller businesses really got hit. And smaller businesses had a much harder time saying, okay, let's take stock of our situation with China. Trump in his first term put across-the-board tariffs on several $100 billion worth of Chinese imports. Biden continued and actually advanced that policy. Now we've got Trump back. The trade war is broadened. Meanwhile, you've got concerns about that we've discussed, like in terms of the monopoly power of shipping companies, and anytime there's a crisis, the prices for shipping go sky high. What do we do about that? Well, a bigger company like Walmart can say, and they have done this, they've said, well, let's apportion the production a little more with a mind toward resilience than we have. So they're moving sourcing from China to India. They're moving sourcing to Mexico. Now, from Mexico, you can get anywhere in North America by rail or truck within a couple of weeks, as opposed to having to wait for 6 weeks, 8 weeks to cross the Pacific. Well, what if you're a small company? I mean, in my book, I tell the story of this one company, a guy named Hagen Walker runs a company called Glow in Starkville, Mississippi, and actually trace what happens with his first container load full of goods moving from a factory in China to his warehouse in Starkville, Mississippi, trying to get these Elmo-themed bath toys for Sesame Street to his warehouse in time for Christmas in 2021. I won't waste all your time here with everything that happens, but it's a messy story. It was a frightening story. At the end of it, he says, I don't want to just be dependent upon China for production. He's a small company. He's still in China because every alternative is imperfect. Oh, Vietnam, lots of companies moving stuff to Vietnam. Vietnam's largely dependent upon the Chinese supply chain for electronics. He can't find the capacity he needs, or he can't even get pricing in places like Cambodia. So small companies are kind of stuck even as they're doing what they can to get more resilient. But the final thing I would say in terms of publicly traded companies, like how did we get into this mess where we were far too dismissive of the risks of the mode of just-in-time plus supply chains across oceans? Because it was good for quarter-to-quarter movements of stock prices. And the CEO of a publicly traded company who says, boy, the pandemic was really nuts. We ran out of all this stuff. Our customers, glad that's over. And someone comes to them and says, well, let's build a new factory as insurance in Mexico or Central America. They're going to dilute their earnings. They could be thrown out by an activist investor, whereas the CEO says, glad that's over. Let's just keep going with this dependence upon China. One day there will be another shock. and it will reveal the folly of that strategy. And with any luck, by then, they'll have cashed out their stock options. They'll be, in some hammock on some beach, lifting a cocktail, saluting their own, foresight. And those incentives are still in place. So that's a real break against the reconfiguration of supply chains.
What's the impact of AI going to have on all this? Because, especially when we get to, we have pretty advanced AI today, but I mean, imagine a year, 2 years down the road. Do you imagine a situation where a lot of the supply chains, especially complex supply chains, are going to be managed by AI that's going to basically configure, advise, kind of program and do everything, and humans will just be kind of, the observers? Because, I mean, hearing you talk, it sounds like the supply chains today are it almost sounds like legacy software where it's kind of working.
That's right.
But it's very, very piecemeal. And the challenge with legacy software, as any large company would know, is that once you're bought into it, it's very hard to get out, because you have to, it takes years to go from one piece of software if you want to switch vendors to go to another one.
Right.
So for a supply chain, you have lots of different people involved, lots of different companies involved. So making changes to that, a lot of companies are probably like, oh man, this is going to take years to do.
Cost a lot
Is
of
it
money
worth
too.
it? Right? I mean, we're locked into what we have. So part of me wonders if AI is going to be able to get infused into this and kind of, make things more efficient.
It's happening. I mean,
yeah.
AI, look, you go to any conference, it's like in every industry, right? Everyone's talking about AI. It is happening. There are investments. There's increasing automation in warehouses, in factories.
Amazon's pioneering a lot of that.
Yeah, sure. And they do a much better job sort of finding areas of wasted motion. But in terms of the whole prediction thing, let's look at the stuff that we've heard for years about financial services, right? So like BlackRock, excuse me, the world's largest asset management firm. They've got this platform, Aladdin, because they manage so much money around the world. Surely they'll know before anyone, what will happen and provision accordingly. And they get people paying them huge consulting fees to get their custom reports and their recommendations. How did all that work during the 2008 financial crisis? How'd that work during the pandemic? I mean, stuff happens that's bigger than us as society, where history, until we're in it, isn't necessarily a particularly good guide. And I think the story of business embracing software as the solution to its problems is it just speeds everything up, and we all end up doing the same thing and that much more quickly, which can actually make the shock worse, right? I mean, if AI, to the exclusion of human common sense, just dictates what we order and when we move stuff around. Well, I mean, here's the part we haven't talked about in this conversation in terms of the pandemic disruptions. Like, I think a lot of your listeners will remember those floating traffic jams off the coast of the ports in Southern California. Now, that's the gateway for 40% of all the imported goods reaching the United States by container. It's the most important port by far, the twin ports of LA and Long Beach. And when the worst pandemic factory restrictions lifted in China and the world got back to like, okay, let's order the stuff we need in China, what happened? A lot of things happened. One thing that happened is all these ships showed up at the same time. There were too many of them. They swamped the capacity to load and unload stuff at the ports. And so they just got stuck in these floating traffic jams. Now, if AI, instead of humans, is determining for a larger share of companies what to order, what to move, what's going to happen? We're going to get more floating traffic jams. Now, I'm not a Luddite. I'm by no means against technology, and I think it's obvious that the opportunities of AI are enormous, and we'd be foolish to not investigate how to use AI in a constructive way. I would just say there will be problems as well as opportunities, and we will always need sober human judgment trying to anticipate how the technology itself can generate new problems and provision against that.
AI without purpose doesn't serve people. That's why many companies have tried and few have succeeded. WorkHuman is one of the ones that have succeeded. With the groundbreaking release of human intelligence, WorkHuman combines AI with real recognition data to help leaders do right by their people and their organization.
It's how you spot burnout before it leads to turnover, or discover hidden strengths before they're overlooked. It's how you build a culture that's not only productive, but sustainable. That's what future ready leadership looks like. Learn more at workhuman.com and see how human intelligence is helping the most forward thinking companies lead with insight, empathy, and impact. Again, that is workhuman.com.
What do you think about the companies that are locked into these old supply chains? Um, just like legacy software. Are they making changes? Is this just once you're in, you're in?
I mean, it's a capital cost, right? Like the supply chain for most of our adult lives has been an incredibly unsexy subject. It'd be
Yeah.
like going to talk to some master of the universe investment banker about like, how's the mailroom working out at JP
Yeah,
Morgan
most
Chase? Like,
people don't.
what? Like,
Yeah, most
I
people
don't
don't
know.
think supply chains are interesting or cool in any way. They just like their
So
product.
that's over, right?
Yeah.
So now you have a lot of CEOs who have certainly figured out, oh, I better understand the supply chain. I better know who's running it. I better trust those people. And I am looking ahead and thinking about technology. I think that part is with us now pretty much permanently, especially as the geopolitics have gotten more complicated. I mean, tariffs alone, right, have forced every company of any consequence to think about its sourcing strategies and rethink them in real time. I mean, as we speak, we don't know if this 90-day pause on the so-called reciprocal tariffs will lift or not. If you're, I don't know, you need to stock your retail shop with tiles, and you can get them from China, or you can get them from India, you can get them from Vietnam, you can get them from Mexico. Like, what are the relative tariffs on that? What are the costs of transporting that stuff? We're worried about war in the Middle East. I mean, these are things that anyone running a business has to be thinking about all the time now, and it's hard to see that going away.
How do you think, or maybe a better question is, why do you think most people, or should most people, pay attention to what's going on in the supply chain? Because some people might be listening to this thinking like, I'm a leader at a company, or I'm a mid-level leader. Like, why? I don't need to care about supply chains. That's somebody else's responsibility.
Yeah, do you like telling customers that you can't deliver the good or service that you promised? Do you like being surprised by the fact that you thought you had a resilient supply chain, but 5 layers down in your supply chain, there's some part that actually draws 90% of the raw material that it needs from the only company on earth that makes it? I mean, the stories I heard as I dug into the supply chain time and again, I remember talking to this guy who runs a medical device company in San Diego. It's a global company. They have a factory in Australia. They have a factory in California. And, he was discovering that he had patients or customers rather who suffered from sleep apnea who needed a face mask that would pump oxygen into their system in the middle of the night. And he couldn't get the computer chips. And he discovered that, first of all, his company was effectively invisible to the suppliers of computer chips because let's bear in mind, back to the Ford example, like the car companies couldn't get computer chips because it turns out they don't even matter. They thought, oh, we're the car companies, that we will always be served. Therefore, we can cut our orders from semiconductors at the beginning of the pandemic to save money. And whenever we're ready to buy more, they'll, of course, satisfy us. Well, no, they're nothing compared to Google and Apple. I mean, and they can't get computer chips, right? So here's this little maker of a sleep apnea device who can't get computer chips, and he starts digging into his own supply chain and discovers that 5 layers down, there's some company that is dependent upon a company in Australia for a mined element that's just impossible to find anywhere else, and demand has gone through the roof, and he's just stuck. And I think if you aren't asking questions about your own supply chain, it's sort of like being a homeowner and not having a plan for what if like the local supermarket shuts down, or what if a tree falls and severs your electrical supply. It's not something you're thinking about all the time. There's lots of better things to think about than what you do in a blackout. But some of the time, you ought to be thinking about that and coming up with backup plans, or you're going to be sitting there in the dark, hungry.
Yeah, and you make an interesting point, right? I mean, a big part of it is also servicing your customers, right? You could easily lose market share. Like I have a friend, for example, who's building a sauna. And he's framing it from scratch, so he has to go to he has guys that are going to Home Depot to get the lumber and stuff like that. And he ordered a heater,
Yeah.
and he ordered a heater around a month ago. And this company where you ordered the heater from, they keep saying, "Oh, it's gonna be shipped to you. It's gonna be shipped to you." And he keeps calling and calling. And he's like, "Hey, what the hell is going on with my heater? You say it's gonna be shipped. It's supposed to be here in a week. It's 2 weeks. It's 3 weeks. It's 4 weeks. Where the hell is this thing?"
Yeah.
Finally, they message him and they're like, "Actually, we didn't know this, but it's been out of stock." And he's like, "What the hell do you mean it's been out of stock? I ordered it a month ago. Why didn't you tell me a month ago it's been out of stock?" And they say, "Well, it didn't show up in our system for some reason that it was out of stock."
That's
And so, it's just,
Wow.
what it is. Meanwhile, he has people who are working on the sauna. They're framing it. They're making the structure. They have to run the electrical. They have to run the wire. They need the dimensions of the heater. And he's sitting there thinking, like, I'm getting this heater any day now. Meanwhile, it's out of stock, and it's been out of stock. And their system didn't tell them. And so it's something a little like that, where now he's pissed off. The workers are angry because they can't finish what they need to do. And this is just a tiny project, right? And so, I mean, if you take something like this and amplify it at scale,
Oh, hell yeah.
thousands of customers, you can see why it can have a potential big impact, because so many people are involved in building this sauna and getting the materials. And so it really made me think of that customer experience story there.
Oh, 100%. I mean, that's not something that people forget, and there are huge societal problems that people care about that they don't necessarily connect to the supply chain. I was interested to be in Phoenix last year doing a story around lack of affordable housing. Obviously, it's an even bigger problem in California where you're sitting, but in Arizona, in Greater Phoenix, I'm not going to get these numbers exactly right, but the share of houses priced at $300,000 or lower, which is like that should be the median in terms of what people's incomes actually are. 90% loss of those units as stuff's gotten priced out, and you can't build more for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons is you can't get the stuff you need. You still can't buy the meters for gas, electrical, and water. So you can't finish these units because they have not recovered from the pandemic era supply chains. The capacity has taken a long time. We're going through a transition to cleaner burning technologies for energy. And one of the reasons why it's so slow in terms of building out the grid we need to move stuff, if you build a wind farm here, a solar array there, you need to connect that to the broader grid. You need substations to produce the power where you need it, when you need it. And all of that stuff is in very short supply. That's a direct supply chain problem that then creates its own supply chain problems, right? So like the company that now wants to erect the battery plant to move faster with the transition to electric vehicles can't do it because they don't have the energy. And they don't have the energy because we can't get the piece parts. I mean, all this stuff just constantly moves around. And we need to better understand. I mean, there's enough complexity out there in modern manufacturing and retail and construction that we need to better understand where the problem areas are.
Where do you think all this is going to go in the future? So if you kind of imagine supply chains 5-10 years out, we obviously have very advanced technology. Do you imagine a situation? It's almost like a railway track, right? Where you can just kind of switch tracks. There's a problem here, you kind of switch here. If there's a problem here, you go here. Do you imagine a situation where we just have these massive supply chain ecosystems that are running by technology, so that if there's a disruption, we can kind of quickly pivot? AI detects it, is able to kind of make changes as needed.
No, I don't think it'll happen that quickly. Well,
No,
I'm sorry. What was your time frame?
I don't know, 5-10 years.
No, I don't think it'll happen that quickly.
Okay.
I think the cost and complexity is too great. I think in some industries it could be like that. I think Amazon might run more or less like that. But I think so long as you're drawing on minerals that are only mined in certain parts of the world, or you're dependent upon industrial processes that are themselves dependent upon lax environmental and workplace safety standards, there are always going to be like very different levels of sophistication, different systems interacting. But politics is an enormous variable in and of itself. I mean, as we speak, we have a government in the United States that is actively telling us trade is bad, globalization is bad. We want to blow up the global trading system. And companies are taking note of this, and for the most part, what they're doing is they're just delaying decisions. They're not, for the most part, building lots of plants in the United States, even the big ticket items like the giant fabs that are subsidized by tens of billions of dollars to make semiconductors. They're growing as slowly as possible, in large part because we don't have the skills, we don't have the raw materials, and we have tariffs on all of the raw materials that we need. So if we are slowing that transition process, that ironically makes us more dependent on the global supply chain, not less. I mean, if you come at this from the standpoint that we need more technology to better understand the choke points in the global supply chain, anticipate and act accordingly, and at the same time, it's a good thing to make more stuff in the United States, or at least closer to the United States, well, that would argue for being able to buy the stuff that you need and hire the people you need around the world as quickly as possible to make it happen. If we're going to be very dogmatic with this idea that, any reliance on the global supply chain is bad, we're just going to have less stuff. And I'll give you a direct example of how I think this has saturated our thinking. I was doing a story earlier this year in Louisville, Kentucky, and I took a trip to one of the bourbon distilleries, because at the time they were worried about retaliatory tariffs from the Canadians and the Europeans on the Trump tariffs. And I took this tour, Angel's Envy Bourbon, and this kind of young hipster guy is leading us through the place. He says, many of you know bourbon, 51% corn is a requirement to be called American bourbon. Now, let me show you the grids. Here's the corn. We get it from, I think, a neighboring county. Here's the barley. We get it from somewhere in Ohio. Here's the rye. Comes in from Canada. Some guy behind me says, why are we buying rye from Canada? That's just, it's close by. It's good quality rye. It's good weather there for it. We get a good price. Well, how can you call it American bourbon if you're using Canadian rye? That's just, we're in America now. I'm American. I assume you are. We're employing Americans. We're selling to Americans. Louisville is in America. And I asked the guy afterwards on this tour, I said, how often do you get that question? He said, 2 or 3 times every day. I mean, if we're really going to live in a world where large numbers of people are walking around thinking that we're buying a grain from a neighboring country where they speak the same language, they have a similar system of law, we've fought as allies in wars together, and we have a trade agreement with them, and that somehow invalidates us to wave the flag around the national provenance of our product. I mean, it makes it impossible to answer any question about the future. I mean, that's just that's a level of madness that's hard for a global supply chain to absorb.
Yeah, no, I mean, trade, I don't think anybody would argue that trade is not important to any economy. In fact, I don't think is there any economy that doesn't trade? I can't think of a single, there's got to be some country somewhere that doesn't trade. That's a ChatGPT question.
I can't think of one.
Yeah, it's got to be a ChatGPT question out there. So yeah, I don't think it's hard to make the argument against trade. I think a lot of people would agree it is important.
Look, we could be self-sufficient if we wanted, but you and me wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd be out tending to our gardens and our sheep, so we could knit sweaters in the winter and try not to freeze to death. I mean, life would be a hell of a lot less interesting if we couldn't draw on the stuff that's. There's a reason why the explorers went looking around the world to see what else they had, right? Yeah. If everything was just hunky-dory at home, we'd all stayed home.
I guess the one country that we probably should have thought of that we didn't is North Korea. That doesn't really do.
North Korea buys a ton of stuff.
According to ChatGPT, countries that don't really trade, it put North Korea, I guess, extremely limited.
Well, they're sanctioned. It's dominated by the government. There aren't individuals can't go out and decide they're going to go on Alibaba or Amazon and buy, paper clips made in Thailand. But they buy oil, right? They buy gas. They buy minerals. They need stuff and they buy it. It's a perfect example of what happens when the state is heavy-handed in dictating those terms and diverting all the goods just to one select group. Those are the people who actually support the regime. It's that's not a model of trade I'd want to live under, nor would anybody, including
You don't
people
want
in
to live
North
under a
Korea.
North Korean.
I'm not waving the flag for North Korea,
Yeah, you're
but
missing out, man.
it's pretty hard to live in the modern world without trading.
I agree. Well, we only have a couple minutes left, so I thought it would be fun to ask you, where do you think all this is going to go? So, I mean, if you had to imagine trade, or if you had to imagine supply chains over the next, well, it seems like 5 years or so, you don't think too much is going to change. But let's say
No,
you were
no,
to,
I think things will change. No, I'm
okay,
not saying things will not change. Look, there will be, or there is a regionalization of supply chains happening. So, so in the U.S., we will draw much more heavily on Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, South America, places where we're not as susceptible to shocks that jack up the cost of ocean freight. The Europeans will draw on factories in Eastern Europe and Turkey, eventually North Africa, and even West and East Africa as development increases. And Southeast Asia and China will have a similar relationship. That regionalization is a real thing, and it's happening.
okay, okay. But then if you had to look even farther than that,
Yeah.
10, 15 years out, um, do you see then a massive potential as far as the impact of AI and technology in there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I take it as a given that technology will continue to evolve and will change all sorts of aspects of life as we know it. But I also think we overdo it with looking at technology to the exclusion of other aspects of life that are often much more important, and geopolitics, climate change. I mean, we're living at a time where nationalism is on the march, and the World Trade Organization is essentially defunct. We don't have a global arbiter for our trade disputes. We've got lots of countries now just imposing tariffs without any legal process whatsoever. And I don't know where that will go, but I think we are in a new era where trade is going to be constrained by interventionist nationalist policies, and that's probably going to make us poorer and more likely to get into actual military hostilities. And I hope that that will give way to something better, where we do have trade and we do have global integration, but we have much greater attention to how we screwed that up. And that attention would go into policies that would ensure that more people benefit, and that the consequences of failure, something like losing your job, are much diminished.
Sounds like the subject of a next potential book, Peter.
Well, I am at work on the next book.
Oh, you
but
are?
yeah, I am. It's on Trump econ policy.
Ah, interesting. So it's going to be a whole book on the current administration's economic policy. When is that one coming
Yeah,
out, or is it too early to tell?
too early to tell. Probably sometime in 2027.
Oh, okay. You still got some
Yeah,
time.
I got some time. Yeah, the supply chain's pretty slow for books.
Yeah. Peter, where can people go to learn more about you? Anything that you want to mention for people to check out?
I got a website, petersgoodman.com. Got my New York Times author page, which I think is just Peter S. Goodman. If you plug that into the Times search engine, I'm on Twitter. I'm still calling it Twitter. Sorry, I'm not that active, but I'm lurking out there. I'm on Blue Sky, all those usual places. LinkedIn's a good one. I
Oh
like
yeah,
LinkedIn.
LinkedIn. Yeah, I'm pretty active
Yeah,
on LinkedIn too.
yeah.
That's
I
been
wouldn't say
kind
I'm
of
active, but I take it more seriously than I did.
all right. Well, Peter,
Yeah.
thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I really appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Future Ready Leadership. If you want to get access to more content on how you can become future ready, make sure to subscribe to the newsletter. It's thefutureorganization.com/newsletter. And if you enjoyed this episode, please send it to somebody who you would like to see become a better leader. Thanks for listening or watching, and I will see you next time.